So we're waiting on Heather, Fortunat, George, and Caitlin. We'll give them maybe one more minute and then we'll get going. Let's head over to View Gallery. Okay. And all right. Okay. Well, nobody else is jumping in. So have I missed Heather, Fortunat, George, or Caitlin? Caitlin, there you are. How are you?
Doing well. Hey.
Great. Fortunat, George, or Heather? No? Okay. All right. Well, good morning. Thanks for joining, and really pleased to have this meeting and an opportunity to hear from everybody about the draft report that Ethan in particular, with Tom's support, created out of all of the previous materials that you were presented with and conclusions that we think you've come to and recommendations that we think you want to forward. But today is the day to sort of ground truth that and get, nuanced feedback from you from the start, sort of overarching reactions from you. And then we will just methodically go through the document sort of section by section, taking edits, comments, suggestions on how to modify. You are also aware that there is a public comment period happening concurrently. Good morning, Fortunat. And that period ends a week from tomorrow. And so we'll be gathering input from the public. We'll be synthesizing that for you so that you have that available to you a week in advance of your final meeting next month. And you'll be able to make additional changes to the document as a result of anything that you'd like to that you're hearing from the public. So that really is the day. It's sort of one big agenda item. But before we jump in, I just wanted to see if the co-chairs had any remarks that they wanted to make before we got started.
I wanted to echo your thanks, Jody, to Ethan and Tom. The work of assembling this draft really relied on everyone's input to date that had been captured in the meeting notes and the meeting materials and the presentations. So it has been a collective effort. And we're hoping that today's dialogue allows us to hear your feedback and areas of improvement or areas of concern, and really hopeful that we can move forward together to make this as good and quality a product as possible. So thanks for your time and attention as always.
And I'd echo the thanks and don't have anything additional to add.
You're muted, Selena.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I just echo the thanks and don't have anything additional to add.
Okay, great. Well, perfect. So then what I think I might suggest is that you turn to the second page of the agenda for a moment. And these are ground rules that you see every month, but I really want to stress three of them for this meeting and for the next meeting. Because, I facilitate group processes a lot, and I don't know if I've mentioned to this group before, but the closer that a group tends to get to a deadline, the more elevated concerns become, emotions become, and what tends to be in the back of everybody's mind is, what does my constituency want? And what I want to just try to remind you all of is that matters. And that's in part why you were asked to be on this working group. But what also matters is sort of the objective of the group as a whole, of what is it that you were trying to accomplish. And I just want to make sure that you sort of keep in mind those dual things, that to the extent that you can advance a product that you can live with, that you're relatively comfortable with, and really produces something that can advance this field writ large. That's the goal. So trying to hold those two objectives at the same time is really important. Being present and engaged today and next month will be critical to arriving at conclusions that you feel comfortable with. And then in an ideal world, committing to working toward consensus. So trying to figure out, listening to others, figuring out what is going to advance a consensus report. If we don't achieve it, we don't achieve it, but that would be the goal. So questions about what we're doing today, other things that you had hoped we would cover, anything in terms of modifying the agenda before we get started? I do know that Matt needs to leave at 10:30. Is there anyone else that needs to jump off early so that I can be aware of it and we make sure that we get your input prior to your departure? Okay. All right. Well, so I think what I was suggesting in my cover email for this meeting was that we just go around and hear from everybody at the start in no particular order with two things. One is, what was your overarching reaction to the report? Tell us very briefly, whatever your reaction was. Secondly, and I'll give you all, we'll sort of have a couple of minutes just to think on this before we get started, is if you were to write down this sentence, I would be more inspired by this report if we blank, whatever that is. And it's not if I could, it's if we. So understanding all of the different perspectives on this group, if we could possibly accomplish X, I would be more inspired by the report if we blank. So I'm going to let you have total silence for a couple of minutes while you think on that. And then whoever wants to jump in can just raise their hand and we'll get started. And so we'll start at 9:10 with that.
Jody, can you repeat that, please? I think my internet access is a little, so you were a little garbled.
Sure. First is, what are your overarching reactions to the draft report? Secondly is, I would be more inspired by the report if we blank. And thanks to Lisa, who put those questions in the chat, or she put it in the question and answer section. And it looks like we have George with us now on with video off. I just want to confirm, George, you're with us. Okay. All right. So anybody at all who feels ready to share their perspective, just raise your hand and we'll get going. Go ahead, Matt.
Well, I figured I would break the seal, break the silence. Good morning.
Can we
I'm
see
sorry,
you or not?
I'm driving. I think I'll spare you.
Okay.
I'm actually going to a solar site on the Monmouth Solar project that we talked about last time. meet. Dan and Hannah actually are coming up to check out the site. So it's appropriate that we're having this conversation. And so I thought just overall in terms of the report, I thought it really captured, it did justice to the good work that everybody has done. And I really thought I think it looks great in terms of sort of capturing the spirit and, you know, of the group. And I know there's been back and forth about, particularly about how this will be used. And I think I still have that concern. So I guess if, you know, to answer the second question, in terms of sort of, I would feel more passionate about or you know, better about this report if I would add something and this is actually in particular after meeting with a couple of farmers recently and walking their land and understanding the serious economic challenges that are confronting farmers today. And I think like maybe never before, you know, I think farms around the state of Maine are gonna fold very soon. And they're under enormous pressure. People are making generational decisions about what to do with the land, sell it for houses. Obviously, that's, you know, why we're talking about this stuff. But I just think I would feel more passionate about this report if it said we are not, in the executive summary, it said we are not trying to take away an economic opportunity for farmers. And, you know, I am deeply concerned that you know, we not walk away from this group feeling like we're headed toward regulation or a press toward making it harder to be a farmer in the state of Maine. Because I think, like Rick Dyer said in the last meeting, he was able to develop 45 acres of 1,000 and keep the remainder of the property in farming because of it. You know, develop 45 in solar, take the revenue, put that in his economic model and say, okay, now I can afford to keep the rest in farming. And I think we need to, and even though 60% of that property is in prime farmland, the property that we developed. So I just wanted to put that out there. I truly appreciate the goal of the group. And I liked your comment, Jody, about sort of trying to find the middle, even where there's some tension, and respecting the goal of the group. And I really appreciate that and see that in the report. So thank you.
Awesome. Super helpful. Thank you, Matt. Who would like to go next? Go ahead, Nick, and then Patrick.
Thanks. I mean, I'll follow that. I had some comments in my mind that were similar to Matt's. I think overall, my overall impression of the report is that it does speak a little bit to the challenges of the task that was at hand, and that there was a group of people, fairly diverse group of people here, trying to hear voices from industry, from community, you know, the list of people that contributed to the meetings is all there. I read a lot of caution in the report. I think that's appropriate. It's not a criticism. I read a lot of caution in the report. I also read sort of the question of how can we afford to do this? How can we meet the challenges of bringing renewables to our state's energy production and portfolio while maintaining the opportunity in the future to raise food and feed ourselves from the agricultural, particularly prime lands in the state. I was struck by going back and rereading LD 820 and some of the other, you know, what we were tasked with doing. And there's, you know, I highlighted, you know, discourage the use of land of higher agricultural value and encourage use of more marginal land. There's actually that bill, that there's nothing in there about what's steadily evolving in the world of agriculture and solar agrivoltaics. That's not we weren't tasked to celebrate agrivoltaics, but there's a lot there, and that we're discovering and learning about all the time. And I guess I would answer the question, I'd be more inspired by the report if we had heard from more farmers actually engaged in agricultural enterprises under, beside, within, next to, around solar. People who were really in the midst of it. The challenge is that, of course, there's not a lot of that happening in Maine, but there is in the country. The challenge then is, what models do we want to pull in from around the country? But it's out there. And I think we just started to scratch the surface, strongly hearing from developers and solar firms wanting to support integration of agriculture. But there are farmers who are struggling with this now, succeeding, failing. I would have liked to have heard more from those folks. And perhaps the communities they live in, who may have started with one perspective, but their perspective might be evolving. So that's how I'd answer those questions.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thanks, Nick. Patrick and then Ellen.
Yeah, so first, my overarching view is without reservation positive. It's not entirely unbridled enthusiasm, because I think we could spend another year parsing every little bit to try to find perfection. But if it came out verbatim tomorrow, I would stand by it without apologies. And I want to thank everybody else on the panel for all your great work on it, and it's certainly been a great experience for me. I would be more inspired by the report if we had been more aggressive about making sure the state meets or even accelerates its renewable energy needs. I think that if we had developed more recommendations to provide support towards that goal, or maybe teeth for getting there, then I'd be more enthusiastic. I know that's a big ask, because at that point we're talking about dollars, but I would have been more inspired by it if we had made our goals a little bit bigger.
Okay, great. Thank you. Ellen, and then Emily, and then Caitlin.
Yeah, I really appreciate all of the work that went into putting the report together. I think there are some good policy tools contained within the report that we're advancing. I think it's a good start. I would have liked to have seen some stronger language. I agree with Nick's assessment that some of it seems very cautious around some of the policy tools that we've been discussing, and even the structure of some of it, just making subcategories of recommendations instead of just, treating some of those subcategories as recommendations themselves, sort of led me to some of those feelings about there being sort of a lot of caution. I also reread the language of the resolve, which I thought was really helpful to really sort of kind of take me back and ground us in what the real purpose of this group is. And I think that I would feel better about the report if that purpose of really trying to figure out that right balance between supporting renewable energy development within the state, while also thinking through how we come up with recommendations so that we provide that support while also trying to minimize impacts to our important agricultural resources. That to me would have felt like more directly tied to our charge and more in line with the purpose of the group. And so, when I went back and, read and thought about, even a lot of the disagreement that emerged around the matrix, when really there's nothing in that prohibits development anywhere in the state, right? It's just sort of a list of considerations and encouragement to kind of ask the question. So if you're talking about developing prime ag soils, have you considered a dual use project? Have you considered developing on more marginal land areas of the farm? And to me, that seems like very much in keeping with the task for our group. Because I was also struck, when Rick presented, that he said a couple times going after Drew that, he wished he had been more aware of some of the other options available to him. And so just thinking through, how we make sure that the report really does speak to the purpose of this group and the balance that we're trying to achieve.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Emily and then Caitlin.
Thanks, Jody. I'm going to echo the sentiment of appreciate all of the hard work and conversation and honest discussion of the members of the group here. And in this report, I too read some caution and some hedging, and I also understand that I think that relates to what I think is missing that I would be more inspired by, and that's part of what Nick mentioned, and really being able to hear more, primary opinions and experiences from farmers, understanding the impact of solar projects might have on their operation, on their viability. And I also think that the other thing that I would like to see in here is that missing solar project data about where, what sort of lands are they on, how many megawatts are actually in the queue. I think that some additional data around that will help us actually get back to that original scope of understanding what we might need to do in terms of how much do we need to prioritize the protection of better farmland. Is this something that is really prevalent in the queue? I think that piece of data might have helped us have some more, some stronger conversations around the matrix, perhaps. So maybe in the next iteration of this, if that happens, really being able to get that solar data, which seems very elusive, would be really, really, I think, important to future conversations.
Go ahead. Thanks. Caitlin.
Thanks. I'll keep it brief. I definitely agree with everything that's been said so far. I think the report does a really good job of summarizing all the learnings that we've taken part in throughout the process, and gives a lot of context for why we came up with these recommendations. So overall, I feel very positive about that. And to echo everything that's been said, I think I would feel more inspired if we did have stronger recommendations, or perhaps just a very strong kind of vision statement conclusion about what the next steps need to be. I think what's missing is kind of the sense of urgency around what we're doing. There are a lot of projects happening right now that are in the queue, to Emily's point. And at the same time, we're facing, climate change, which brings its own sense of urgency. So I think if we can somehow weave that urgency and just stronger language throughout the report into what are the next steps and what is our vision coming out of this, would be great to see.
Perfect. Thank you. Fortunate. And then Eliza.
Thanks. So I think, like Caitlin said, I think the report does an excellent job of capturing the learnings from the conversation so far. And I think for those who have not been able to follow along with our work, it will be a really useful, that part will be super useful. Well done and well organized. I would be more inspired by the report if we worked a little bit harder to frame it as an affirmatively positive vision for the mutually co-beneficial development of solar and rural economies in Maine, as opposed to, it's easy for us to slip into sort of zero-sum trade-off kind of thinking, as opposed to, yes and kind of thinking. And I think they're legitimately, and we've heard from, from farmers and other advocates, examples of this. There really is an opportunity for us to do this in a way that is not sort of damage minimizing, but is benefit maximizing. And I would love it if the report overall had that tone.
Perfect. Eliza, thank you, Fortunate.
Yeah, I really like what Fortunat just said about more of an emphasis on the mutual beneficial relationship. I want to emphasize that again, and see about how we could change the tone of the report to match that. I'm also really was inspired by what Patrick said, and I made me realize that something that is missing in here, I believe, is what I see and believe as this group's commitment to meeting the state's renewables goals. And also, part of that, meeting that goal is also making sure that costs to ratepayers remain reasonable. And I think if we really emphasize those 2 points and the point that Fortunat made, I think that is really helpful in addressing some of the concerns that I heard from others about this being a little bit more cautious or perhaps not farmer friendly. That I think is where I would like to see a larger change. And I make that comment amongst the general feeling that I see that this is a really great report, and I'm overall very supportive of it. But then to answer the more specific question about what would make me more inspired, I think maybe I already heard this from Emily, but getting a little bit more into the implementation details. And perhaps part of that comes from a lack of clarity on my part on whether we are reporting to the GEO and DACF or the legislature or both. Whether we're following the climate action plan or LD 820. And I think understanding who our audience is a little bit better will help us determine the level of detail that we need to get into when thinking about implementation. I've seen far too many stakeholder reports be suggestive when, particularly when you have the legislature as an audience. The more specific you can be, the more likely you're going to actually see some results. I'm a little concerned that particularly if we have the legislature as an audience in mind, that this might languish a little bit because there's still quite a bit of work that needs to be done to bridge the gap between recommendations and implementation. And I recognize that what I'm sharing right now is a really big ask, because there's one thing for us to get agreement on larger principles. It's a whole nother thing for us to get agreement on actual, bill language, et cetera. But what I would say is that the more we can kind of creep towards specificity, understanding that even as we get more specific, we are ultimately giving recommendations. These aren't final decisions. The more likely we're going to see specific outcomes from our really wonderful efforts.
Great, thank you, Eliza. Jeremy. You're muted.
I think that's a great point that Eliza just made on who the audience is. And I think I've probably been saying that for many months, as I still don't know who is getting this and what is the purpose for it. So I think we need to be able to answer that question. So I agree completely. I also really liked what Fortunat just said about trying to beef up the mutually beneficial language. I think if somebody read the report, they might leave feeling like, well, wow, we've got a big problem and here's a bunch of data and we really need to do something about it. I don't think that's what any of us want to leave readers with. I think hopefully what we're trying to do is create a report that talks about opportunity, so long as it's designed correctly. Now, some of us may differ on what designing the future of solar correctly looks like, and maybe that's what we'll get to in successor effort, but at least for now, I think we need to talk more about that. And then just briefly to just echo what Matt said at the outset, I really appreciate all the work that went in to, I think, toning down or making clear what the goal of this the siting matrix is, but I definitely still have lingering concern about how that could be used, and I hope I'm wrong, but I'll probably be screaming "I told you so" if in a year or two we start to see this matrix find its way into permitting decisions. But overall, I think the report is really well done. You know, Ethan and Tom did a bang-up job, much better than I could have done based upon some of the scattered conversations we've had over the last number of months. So appreciate their great work.
Great, thank you, Jeremy. Who have we not heard from yet? Andy, Selena, Nancy, who else am I missing? Andy, can I put you on the spot? Are you okay with that?
Sure. Overall, I mean, I echo what everybody else said. I think that the report does a really good job of summarizing all of the conversations and meetings that we had. I guess I would feel more inspired if one, that I had more faith that, you know, this report after, you know, gets back to the legislature and everybody does what they're going to do, you know, some of the messaging in here actually comes out on the other side in form of whatever that is going to be at the state level. I guess I also, you know, the report talks a lot about dual use. That seems to be, you know, what our meeting in the middle of, you know, the needs of agriculture and the needs of solar development and all of that. I think I would feel more inspired and more confident that this document was going to do a lot if I had more confidence that dual use was really ready to go and economically viable in a major way. In my recent conversations with the developer about a portion of our farm, talking about raising panels up for dual use cattle grazing, I was told flat out, no, it's not economically feasible. So it just feels like, you know, there's a lot of emphasis put on dual use in here, but it's not being done in a major way anywhere that I really know of. And I'm hearing from at least one developer that it's not economically feasible. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave it there.
Got it. Okay, thank you. We've not heard from, I think I might ask the co-chairs to go last. So we've not heard from George or Julianne. Have I missed anyone else on the stakeholder group itself? So if either of you would like to comment, please.
I'm happy to go next, Jody. You know, I will echo everyone's support of, you know, I do feel that the report overall did capture the work that we did, but I think there is a very critical perspective that is missing from this report, and that is of the landowners. In Maine, we have, let's see, what is it? 794,320 acres that are identified as prime farmland. We have 2,106,549 acres as statewide important farmland. We have, as of the 2017 agricultural census, approximately 1.3 million acres in agricultural production. So we have nearly 1 million acres or over 1 million acres that are usable for agricultural production that are not currently being used. We have lost 10% of our farms just between 2012 and 2017. So when we're talking about putting on restrictions, putting on requirements, putting on substantive constraints for farmers of what they can do with their land, this report is not really identifying, you know, that significant loss of farms and what the potential is for solar to keep farms in production. We really only heard from one farmer throughout this whole experience, and I think that, you know, we're not really identifying clearly what the landowners need And we're coming at it from more of a regulatory perspective without having that true consideration of what farmers can do and what farmers need and what landowners can do and what landowners need. We've come at it from an idealistic, we want to achieve a certain goal of renewable energy, and that is admirable. But as Andy mentioned, I mean, if it's not doable, if it's not economically feasible, will our report ultimately harm farmers more than it will help them?
Got it. Thank you. Do we have George with us? Okay. Then we'll pass over him and remarks from Nancy and Selena. Oh, here you go, George. Would you like to comment?
All set for now. Thank you.
Okay. Nancy or Selena?
Thanks for all these great comments. I really appreciate them. I overall have thought that the report has pulled together all of the themes that have been dealt with by the group in a organized and structured way. And I think that there's opportunity to polish and enhance and in fact enlarge particular portions such as in our recommendations, which I'll get back to in a second. To address the questions of who the audience is, I don't believe ultimately that it's the Department of Agriculture or the GO. It's the legislature. All things ultimately in the state go to the audience of the legislature. So the vehicle of LD 820 helped with the underpinning of this group coming together. So I think we have a report, and that ultimately is the report out to the legislature. So I think I'm hearing a lot of people's caution and thoughts about how to ensure that this is presented in a way that can be descriptive, a learning tool, and a framework for legislators to reference and utilize going forward. And I think we just need to keep that in mind for the final product. I would be more inspired if we were able to really build out some of our recommendations. And I appreciate that Caitlin or someone else said, you know, let's have a vision statement or some sort of summary at the end that can speak to the urgency and really encapsulate what we believe the legislature should consider, or what a next step should be, such as an additional working group on X. So for instance, I'm thinking that if dual use pilot is really one of our recommendations, because that, if it's robust and really well designed and talks about all of the really intricate, important factors of making a pilot successful, then let's say that, let's build that out a little bit more. And then, you know, in our summary, perhaps make that a suggestion. I'm just throwing that out there, but I hope you see that that is an example of action, of next steps, and perhaps urgency, and a way to get that by really building out a couple of our recommendations. So that's, I think, where I'd feel good about moving next.
Great, thank you. Selena.
I would echo everyone's comments about the report, and I think it does a good job of summarizing the complexity of the issues that we're trying to grapple with here. And I think when you read the first part of the report, you see the areas that we could really delve into, the data that we need, the vast programming that we could implement, and then you read the recommendations that are a little bit more manageable, not as aspirational potentially as what has been done in other places. And I think that just matches the need for us to have more experience, information, data, learn from others. And so I think it's an appropriate place for us to be. I think we've done a good job of getting to this modest step in the recommendations that we have, but there is a tension between what could be done versus what we have in the recommendations. But I think that goes to Nancy's point about laying out what the future next steps should be and delineating which recommendations we feel are actionable now and which ones we need to take to further audiences for discussion. And I think Nick's comments around the voices, different voices, farmers, others being brought to the table is really essential. And I want to make sure that we identify which recommendations really would warrant either in this report or future working groups to have a way to bring in those landowners, farmers, communities, other people to have an ability to help us shape those policy proposals. Because even with the comments that people have made today, I'm struck by the thoughtfulness of this group and the effort that people have put into it. But there are other people who I think we also need to hear from before making major policy changes in this area.
Great. Okay. Well, this is awesome. I think hopefully that was helpful for all of you to hear the perspectives of the rest of you to see sort of where we're at in general. My thought had been to sort of pivot to, literally taking this report section by section. If you feel like that, if you have sort of a different idea about how to tackle this, my instinct is that we'll be able to get through the first many sections relatively quickly, because it's more of a what did you do, what did you learn. You may want to characterize those summaries differently, and we'll go through that. But with the hope of devoting most of the time to the conclusions and the recommendations section, and how you might want to modify or flesh those out more. Does that sound like a reasonable approach, or any other thoughts that you'd like to suggest for a way to tackle this? Okay. Well, then what I'd suggest then is that you move to page 5 of the document, section 2. Section 1 will be an executive summary, which has not yet been written, obviously, in order to capture your thinking today, and then also how you want to take into account public comment. And Tom Gordon, if you're on the line currently, if you want to just jump in at some point and let folks know if public comments have been received to date, if at all, that would be great. But if you want to turn to page 5 and just jump in if you have any edits or comments that you'd like to make on page 5 and 6, which is all of section 2. The stakeholder group purpose describes Maine won't wait, LD 820, and the purpose of the report. Anything that wasn't mentioned in your initial comments, because we're tracking those.
This is a minor thing, but I was just wondering in the first sentence, actually, where it says prime farmland and soils of statewide importance, and then it says that could be used as farmland in the future are critical natural resources. And I was just wondering why it's, I don't know, I didn't know with the sentence construction if that they're only talking about like land that could, those resources, those types of soils that could be used as farmland in the future, or whether that was.
So are used and could be used?
Yeah, yes. That's what I was wondering, if that would be a better edit, a better change to the sentence.
Did any of you, when I was rereading this last night, I realized that, unless I've missed it, that we didn't include the actual definitions of prime farmland and soils of statewide importance that we've been using from the start. Did I miss that? And if so, would you all see that as a useful addition? Okay. All right, we'll add that in. Other comments on this section?
Just a brief note to say, I really liked what Nancy said about wanting to incorporate action and urgency. And I think in this purpose of the report section is where you can both specify that the legislature or be more specific that the legislature is an audience, and that our aim is for them to be able to take this report and have some action items to react to.
Nick, did you have?
Yeah, thanks for noticing. It says that there's going to be an executive summary that'll come before the report's completed. I think there's frankly a lot of the comments that we started with can be peppered into that executive summary and or conclusion. I the one that's sticking with me is the one that Fortunat brought up, that, you know, not less bad, but more good. And I think that maybe can't go back and be put in a general purpose statement, but I do think that some of what we talked about before we move on should go in the executive summary conclusion. I just want to say that part because I think that's a really succinct way to sum it up. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And another reason why we've taped what, you know, we tape every meeting, but I think it'll be easy to pull all that forward from that tape. Other comments on this section? Okay. Oh, go ahead, George.
I think we probably should have a sentence in there acknowledging we've never really gotten into discussing forests. And I think that that's a healthy thing to do. It's not a, you know, we talked about farms. Obviously, some of the soils under a forest could be considered soils of statewide importance, but I think we need to acknowledge we haven't talked about forests or working forests or anything to do with places that are primarily trees.
Yeah, okay.
And I think it probably needs to be in the, I was debating whether to offer this as part of the conclusions or put it up front. I actually think it needs to be front loaded.
Sure. Okay. All right. Nick.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I had one other thing. I don't know if you're referring to, are you referring to the whole page 5, Joe, when you're asking about this section, or just
yeah.
Yeah, okay. So
yeah.
It jumps around between use of language prime, statewide importance, and then when it's looking back at strategy E from Maine Won't Wait, it's referencing natural and working lands. I do think it is wise to bring in definition of prime soils and soils of statewide importance, because I think there's a little bit of room for, and if you look down at LD 820, it's talking about marginal lands,
right.
Which we discussed as a group. So I hope there isn't confusion, particularly when it gets to a potential legislative process, to all of a sudden start grouping land. I mean, you could spend as much time defining land here if we don't use specific definitions as we did on the finer points between co-location and dual use within this group. So I just sort of jumping in there.
Yeah. Well, so if I'm understanding the point, and when I raised this issue earlier, I was imagining a footnote at the bottom of page 5 that would pull forward the definitions for prime farmland and soils of statewide importance and locate it there. If anybody has concerns about that, definitely speak up, and you'll also have the chance to look at this in revised form next month. Fortunat, go ahead.
This is a little bit duplicative of Nick and George's comments, but I know I've been guilty of this, and I've heard others, both inside and outside the group, guilty of this, of sort of referring to this group as shorthand as the Solar Siting Working Group. And we've been pretty clear internally that we are sort of working at the intersection of solar and ag, and not considering solar siting more broadly. I think it's worth making that point, because the report can be sort of misunderstood, to George's point, that we're not talking about forests. I mean, the exception to forests, they are categorized in one of these types of land. You're not talking about landfills and parking lots and rooftops. And those conversations are useful, but they're not part of our charge.
Great. Okay, good. Anything else before we move on to section 3, which I wouldn't imagine you probably would have any comments on, but you never know.
I would just add, perhaps hopefully, by making it clear what we're not talking about, I think it means that the things that we are proposing and encouraging, I think are more likely to be successful. And so the things where we do want to do something positive for agriculture, I think by making it clear to a lot of stakeholders that your industry or your land holdings or your opportunities are not addressed by this report. This is really about farming and how we deal with the challenges to food and feed production, both now and in the future, and how that intersects with renewable energy production. And I think that gives us a lot more breathing room to have positive outcomes and to get the things that we're trying to get out of this by making it clear what we're not talking about, and what we haven't addressed, and what we're not interested in getting dragged down into. And I just, I want to see something good come out of this for farms.
Great, thank you. Okay. That's clear. Any other comments on section 2? All right, section 3. Unless there were stakeholders that we're not aware of, my instinct is that we can move on from that. Section 4 as well. Any questions about that? Any comments? Okay. So section 5 is a background. We can sort of take these separately, but the purpose of section 5 and section 6 was to really sort of lay some background for both the solar industry and for the current state of Maine agriculture. And there are different members on this group that have familiarity with one sector over another. So let me just open it up for comment on the solar energy policy and industry landscape. Anything that you feel should be included in there that isn't? Yeah. George, did you? Go ahead.
So in any discussion about renewables and electricity, I think right now it's really important to talk about demand. And so in this, and in particular, future projections of demand. And the future projections of demand are really, I think, where the concern for farms is coming from, because we know that there's a lot of desire to build new renewable energy sources and solar farms. And there's also an increase in electrical demand coming because we're doing a conversion in transportation fuels right now. So I think that in a background overview, it's not only important to do the backwards facing or analysis, which we have in the solar generation installed in Maine. I actually think we need one other chart showing the projected increase in electrical demand within the New England ISO. And we could do it maybe within just Maine's own things, but I think it's crucial in terms of acknowledging the pressure that's out there for new electrical production, to acknowledge what the demand situation is, and to show projections based on a 10 and probably 20-year time frame, which today are probably radically different than they would have been 24 months ago. Mm-hmm. I think it's really, really important, and it explains why we have an issue.
Sure. Just reactions to that from Selena or anyone else about that?
Yeah, I'd be happy to add. We have some language from the Maine Climate Council about projections related to electrification, beneficial electrification, and we can add language related to that.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Anything else that folks think should be added, Fortunate?
Well, and Selena, I should know this, but does the Climate Council report also talk about sort of an assumption about what fraction of that future load comes from various renewable sources? I know there's been some analysis by different groups over different time horizons, but I'm thinking about sort of out to 2040, out to 2050. To George's point, so we have an idea of sort of like, we will eventually have to locate 7,500 megawatts of PV in Maine. for main load, maybe more than that if we're supplying some New England load too. So that's useful for a question of sort of scale.
Yeah, and a combination of the Maine Climate Council report, and then also the Governor's Energy Office has done a renewable energy market assessment, which also shows projections out until 2030 to 2040. And so while there's some flexibility in terms of how we'll meet our significant energy needs, solar will be a part of it, so we can put some of that data in there.
Perfect. Okay, great. Anything else on the solar side? Okay. All right, then let's move on to section 6 that tried to give a snapshot overview of Maine agriculture and solar development potential. Reactions to that section? And I don't know, Julianne, if you're still on the line, if you're still on the call, but it might be helpful to get your specific reactions to that section, and if you can envision additions to that section that might address some of the concerns that you raised in your introductory comments.
So the statistics that I provided were all developed through the agricultural census, and I'm happy to share that report, but it's available online. And the report on the map of prime and statewide important farmland soils for Maine, that's available from USDA.
Let me just put Tom Gordon on the spot for a second. Are you on the line right now? I know you've got a lot going on this week.
Yes, I am.
Does that work for you? Do you feel like, based on what you heard of Julianne's comments from the start and then this feedback, that do you feel comfortable modifying this section?
What type of modification are you actually looking for on this?
We'll go back to the tape. I don't want to go back to it, but I'll circle back to you.
Understand that there are several ways to calculate farmland and soil type. So even within USDA, there are differences in acreages, and that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, so I think maybe at least capturing farmland loss more directly in this section, I guess, would be the overarching feedback, if I could paraphrase Julianne. Let me take Caitlin, then Andy, then Nick, then Ellen, if I got you all in the right order. I'm not certain I did.
Thank you. Just one quick note on page 12. In the first paragraph there, it says solar development is a potential means for income diversification for farms. I think it would be great if we can expand on that point with either some examples or any numbers we can find about how many farms are currently using solar, or like any of the examples we've talked about in this group so far, just to add a little bit more context to that sentence.
The location again, I didn't think the page number. What page number? You were saying 12?
Page 12, yes.
The sentence is what line?
Line 4.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Andy, go ahead.
I would appreciate just a little more, I think this would be a good section to just build off of what George said in terms of, what electrical demand is going to be. I think this would be a good section to talk about. We are projecting that we need this many megawatts of solar power. This is roughly how many acres we anticipate this development will have to occupy if it's ground mount. I think just clarifying what the issue is that we've been discussing and why it was significant enough that we even had to form this group and have these conversations, just some sort of, just clarifying that projected land development would be great.
Okay. Yep, makes sense. Nick, go right ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to identify something that I highlighted when I was rereading the report. Line number 2 and 3 and 4 on page 11, where it says Maine farmers are the stewards. And it says, in addition to active farming, land provides public benefits of open space, recreation, wildlife habitat, and natural resource preservation. I just want to point out, not to do it to death, but the only income producing thing in that is the active farming. All of the other things that are provided in that line by farms and farmers are part of being good stewards. And there's an expense to that. So I just want to point it out. It's expensive to be a good steward. I'm not saying it's not worth it, but farms provide much more than just the products that they grow or create. And it's well identified in that line, all the things farms do, and you could add to it. I'm just pointing out, active farming is the only outright income producing thing mentioned there, as a way to underscore that farmers can always use some help and some viability and some added income streams. I also want to build on page 12 on line 3 and 4. I agree with Caitlin diving into that. And it's kind of where some of what Fortunate had mentioned before. Solar development is a potential means for income diversification for farms, but it's also absolutely has the potential to provide some greater economic viability for the communities. That takes work and support for added infrastructure, but assuming that there are viable agricultural enterprises enhanced by farming solar, those products need markets to go to. They need processors to handle it. With investment, hopefully, and support and conviction, it also could help grow a local economy. It could help grow infrastructure, but it obviously needs the right levers and support to do so.
Just a point of clarification, Nick, give me 1 second, sorry. On your comment on the prior page, were you simply pointing something out, or would you like?
No, I don't know. I was simply pointing something out.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Which we've talked about. Yeah, apologize for sort of doing it to death, but never hurts. So.
No, apology. I think we had Ellen, and then Nancy, and then George, I believe.
Mine is really quick. I was just saying, I think a bunch of the references that Julianne made to farmland loss is actually already included in the report. Maybe there needs to be a reference to the ag census instead of just the dates, but I just wanted to point that out, that if you look at from lines 14 to 17, that info is in there. I mean, Julianne should check to make sure some of the statistics she wanted to include are included, but it does look like a bunch of the ag census data is included.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. So we've got Nancy and then George.
Sorry, just to follow up on that, that is talking about land ownership. It's not really addressing the loss of farms. So I think those are two different statistics. And I did just email out to everyone the map of the prime farmland that was produced by USDA and the statistics from the 2017 ag census.
Okay. That's great. Thank you. So Nancy and then George.
One thing occurs to me on page 12, early in the discussion of that first paragraph, where solar development is a potential means for income diversification. Just a thought of adding additional language around the fact that farms are, to Andy's example, real life example, are receiving a lot of interest by solar developers and may face a real learning curve as to what this means, what it all entails, and then reference that there is some guidance already out in the Maine universe and beyond. I just think we could footnote it, et cetera, about Maine Audubon's tools, ours from the department. I know it's in it may be referenced later in our appendices, but it just might be helpful for the audience to know that there are some tools, and we could certainly even say, regardless, more policy needs to be developed around this to help these players. I don't know if people see that as a helpful addition, but it occurred to me it might be used flagging that.
So anybody can just speak up if you have concerns about that being added, but let me, in the meantime, move on to George.
Yeah. So to speak to Andy's point, I think putting the land pressure figure in this particular section, when you're shaping public thought or helping somebody understand something, I think that it potentially leads to the implication that all of the land pressure that's going to come from solar development is going to be focused on lands that are either currently agricultural, or farms in general. And while I think there is going to be a lot of pressure on farms, I don't think it's exclusively going to be on farms. In fact, I think that certainly from what we're seeing up here, all of our solar development up here is focused on forests. And so that presents an entirely different set of challenges for us and for our forest products industry here. But I would say that we have a lot of farmland up here. We have the single largest potato producing region outside of Aroostook County. And we have not seen solar development push really hard into ag yet. And I would not be surprised if it does in the future, especially again with the amount of demand we have. So I would say that I think it's a very good idea to make sure we know how much land potentially is under pressure, but I don't think it should be in this particular section, because that implies that potentially all of that demand maybe is going to be directed at farms, whereas maybe only half ends up going to farms. Still a problem, but I don't think it's exclusively an agricultural problem. One other point that I think is important for this section specifically is I think we should have a map by county showing the percentage of each county that has prime farmland acreage. And I think for a legislator, I think it's very, very important to see these types of maps, and you do the, just a traditional color-coded, percentage of total lands that are prime farmland for any given county in Maine, 16 counties, here's the percentages, here's where this land that we're concerned about is concentrated. I think that's a very, very basic legislative tool that should be directly in this particular section, not as an appendix.
Thanks, George. Andy, do you want to react to any of that?
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think more broadly, I just think it would be helpful, for folks who are reading this document to have a clear understanding of like, okay, we need this many megawatts of production and a megawatt occupies roughly this amount of land, and spell it out somewhere just so we have an understanding of what the scope of the development that we could be talking about is. And I just had another point, just in talking about farm ownership, like there's a statistic about farm ownership in this section. I just think it's really important for folks to realize that farmers of all scales and ages, sizes, rely heavily upon lease land, and that ultimately we have no control over what happens on that lease land. And I've heard a lot from farmers expressing the same sort of feelings that Rick expressed. That I just need to develop this small portion and I'll be able to reach economic stability. I've also heard a lot from farmers in my area who are deeply concerned because they're losing, hay fields or whatever that they've leased for a long time to solar development. And I just think that it's important to just make that dynamic clear somewhere, because so far in this section and a lot of the talk I've heard is just, well, farmers are making decisions about their land. And across the board, farmers lease a lot of land that they don't get to make those final decisions on. And it's not economically viable for most of them to, go out and purchase all that land. That's why they lease it. So.
Great. Yep. Very good point. Okay. Other comments on, I'm just reading the comments. Caitlin's, the other side of the nuance is that not all development pressure is from solar. Yep. Emily.
Thanks, Jody. I just want to make maybe just a point on the data again. I think what we're all asking for is a lot more data on some of these things, if that's possible, and to include some specific summaries. And regarding the farmland loss, I just shared with the stakeholder group the American Farmland Trust Maine report, which shows farmland loss from 2001 to 16, and that does not include solar. So that's just historic conversion. And I think it's fair to discuss land threats in potential conversion, but I do think we need to just note that we are just focused on the farmland aspect, and that all of that farmland, or excuse me, all of that pressure is not solely directed at farmland, but I think it's fair to at least to put some language in here around that. We know that because it's open and flat and easy to develop, that it is still a key threat to farmland specifically. I think that with some data in the section around that, we might be able to frame how this working group is really just focused on the farmland aspect, but I think it's important to note that.
And Emily, you're saying you shared that by email, not in the chat?
Yes, I just shared that, the Maine state report by email.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. All right. Shall we move on from this section? A lot of feedback on it. We have the tape. We'll do a major redrafting. Tom Gordon will be the focus of that work. He was the lead drafter of this section. So if you have additional thoughts in the next 24 hours or so, you could send them his way if you think that they would be helpful in the redrafting process. Can we post your document, Emily, to the meeting materials? Why don't we plan to do that? Ethan, we can pull that into this meeting's materials on the website. Okay, anything else on this section before we move on to section 7? All right. We have 10:15 right now. I just want to check in with Matt because I know we only have you for 15 minutes more, if we have you at all still, and see if there were any final comments that you wanted to make before we lost you.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for remembering. No, I think this conversation's been great. I just on Monday, I spent time with a family farm, multi-generational farmer, Central Maine. They are really concerned about their economics. They said their neighbors are as well. And I think maybe unlike, at least, I mean, they've owned the farm since 1974. It's 800 acres. They are just not sure what to do. And they were talking with me about possibilities around solar, around the net energy billing program, sort of what the future of their farm is with respect to solar, and could they keep the farm? That's stark a choice, and they don't have a lot of economic opportunity. So I just wanted to offer that perspective, that I think this is, I think Caitlin said it, like there is some real urgency today, not just from a climate perspective, but from the landowner perspective. I think it was Julianne who said also that we really need to consider the landowner's perspective here. I think they are in an acute situation where they're looking for economic opportunities that will help them keep their farms in farming, and to Fortunat's point, and capture this other opportunity, right? With these are mutually beneficial sort of things, right? And so, yeah, the comment about dual use, yes, it's expensive, but it's aspirational. This farm, just to the last thing is, the farmer was asking, like, could we be a sample farm? Could we be an example farm that we could demonstrate the beneficial cooperation of solar and farming? So I think there's real interest on the part of the agricultural community to be adventurous and aspirational about what we could do together to do the and work, the kind of, how do we make these two things mutually beneficial? So that was it, just recent experience. And thank you for taking my comments.
Great. Thank you so much. Then what I think I might suggest is let's see if we have a lot of comments on section 7. We might be able to get through this section quickly. I'm not sure. My instinct would be to try to do that and then take public comments and then take a break briefly and then come back to deal with the conclusions and recommendations section right after the break. How does that sound to folks? 10:15 right now. Okay. All right. So why don't we take sort of New Massachusetts and New Jersey together, which is most of page 13. Any reactions to those sections? Go ahead, Caitlin, and then Ellen.
I just had a few minor edits to the New Jersey section.
Yeah.
I wanted to note on line 26, where it specifies research purposes with Rutgers. That can be with any public university in New Jersey. So just wanted to make sure that that is clarified. And then on line 33, it says encourage more development off farmland. I just think that's supposed to be more development of farmland, or I think that sentence just needs to be clarified.
Okay. Yep, great, thank you. Ellen, go ahead.
I was just hoping that in the first paragraph of the New Jersey section, I think it would be more clear when we say of New Jersey's 779,000 acres, all but 101,000 acres would be protected given their soil quality, farmland protection status, or recognition in the county. If there was just a little bit more detail about how that land is protected, like what the mechanisms are that are in place that would keep that land from being developed.
Was it clear? Do you know that? Do you know the answer to that or not?
I don't.
Yeah, okay. I recall that Ethan saying that. Emily, would it be possible for you to circle back to Ethan to get that answered? Is Emily still with us? She might have had to jump off.
Yeah, sorry, my video is wonky. I can do that.
Okay, thanks. And Nancy.
Did you just call on me, Jody? Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm taking us back up to Massachusetts.
Mhm.
I think that there's probably an opportunity to build out a little bit more of what we're talking about in the final sentence in terms of, and I know that we referenced our minutes or summary of the, I think, June or July discussion here. So it may be hard to go back and refresh our recollection of that. But if I were a legislator reading this, I'd be intrigued as to, okay, the groups on merits, what were they? But what's the difference? And why is this not more of a viable option, or what are the detriments? So I just think that if it's possible, I know that Emily gave a really good overview of Massachusetts SMART program and the fact that it's changed and the various zigs and zags that program has gone through, that it might be worthwhile building this out a little bit more to be more descriptive and why we came to the summary conclusion here that we have. And I'm happy to work with Emily and others to find an appropriate way to build that out modestly. If that's sounds good to
okay
folks.
with that?
Sounds
I
good
mean,
to me.
I think what I was hearing from your discussion back whenever that was that in general, you didn't think it was the right model for Maine to adopt. Exactly why is in the weeds, but I think if you all are comfortable with Nancy and Emily drafting that and adding that in for the next version, just speak up if you are concerned. Ellen, go ahead.
I'm not concerned, but I think that was true, that the whole SMART program itself, like just taking that and trying to drop it in Maine, I think people recognize that wasn't necessarily workable, but I think there was interest in different components of it. I mean, adders, for instance, right? Those rose to one of the top 5, policy tools that people were interested in. I know we want to have the discussion of that in sort of a broader discussion of adders in general, but I think it would be good to sort of spell out. I know we talked later in the recommendations about adders, but just, what pieces there was some interest in.
Okay, I think that that's clear. I'm seeing you nodding your head, Nancy, so we'll leave that in your and Emily's court if we may. Emily, I'm not seeing your face, so I'm not sure if you're cringing or not.
Yeah,
but
sorry, that's fine.
Okay, Patrick, go ahead.
So as we've been going through this entire report, I'm cognizant that we're noticing a lot of places where we can add things, and I'm worried that that may become burdensome for our audience. I think a 30-page report probably gets a full cup of coffee and maybe a follow-up phone call. 50-page report might just get a glance at the executive summary. So I think that section 7 here might be a place where we could pare it down a little bit. For example, in New Jersey, starting at line 17, the sentence that starts, however, from there to the end of the paragraph, I think really kind of gets into the weeds of what's happening in New Jersey. It may not be as relevant to what we're doing here. I think just recognizing that New Jersey is similar to Maine in that it has the land pressure is enough to say why we consider New Jersey. And then maybe in a footnote, we could say like what we're referencing or for further reading or something along those lines.
General reactions about the length of the report and the detail in here, maybe not specifically about this paragraph. Ellen, were you thinking of responding to that or not?
I was, but more specific to that paragraph.
That's fine. Go ahead. Sorry.
Well, just part of the reason I was asking about sort of what tools were at play, right? That sort of removes that acreage. I'm just wondering what that is. And so I think once we get a little bit more clarity, that may or may not be sort of informative for the topics, the discussion that we're having here. So I guess I wouldn't be in favor of totally removing that unless.
Okay. Okay. Let's see. Then anything else on Massachusetts and New Jersey before we move on to Vermont? And yeah, before we move on to Vermont. All right, then any comments on Vermont?
I just had a question, Joe.
Please.
I'm jumping way down, but on page 22, I don't know if it's referring to Vermont allows taxation laws of Vermont allow farms in the open use taxation. Is that what they call it, or is it a current use program? Open use, current use. It just jumped out off the page of me. That's all.
Okay, we'll check on that.
Thanks.
Yep. It might be open space, current use. Anything else on Vermont? All right. Then, basically 14 through 21, I'm sorry, 14 through 18, my apologies, is, essentially a summary of all of the different presentations that were Maine-based. Happy to tease that apart, but let me just see if you all have comments on any of the sections and see how much we need to focus on them.
Sorry, are we taking page 18 as well, the additional policy considerations? Are you including that in comments now or later?
Yeah, let's do that.
I thought that was an area where I thought the language should be changed a little bit to reflect I thought at the end of our last meeting, especially when we were talking about the in lieu of fee, Nancy had suggested some language that, this, although, at this point, there's not a lot of sort of information related to other examples of this type of tool, that this was, a mechanism that should be explored in the future. So I can't remember exactly what you said, Nancy, but something along those lines. And I thought that would be helpful to include here as well.
Any concerns about that? Reactions to that, Eliza, I think, and then Caitlin, if I got you in the right order.
Not a reaction to that, so feel free to go, Eliza.
Also not a reaction to that.
Okay, then let me just take the two of you in whatever order I just said. Can't remember.
Just quickly, I wanted to bring attention to the third-ish paragraph on page 18, so starting with line 6. I just thought this paragraph was kind of confusing. Maybe I'm happy to volunteer to work offline just to wordsmith a little bit to make it a little bit clearer about which projects are exempt and what this paragraph means, but just wanted to flag that.
Great. Okay. Then why don't I have you, thank you, be in touch with Ethan directly about that, and maybe send him revised language for him to take a look at.
Sounds good.
Thank you. Eliza.
My comments are also a little bit on the wordsmithing end of things, so I'll send specific things to Ethan, but I'll say briefly that I think we might be well served by changing the header to additional policy discussions, and then as opposed to considerations, because I think it's hard to kind of it's hard to distinguish this section from the recommendation section, I think, with that header. However, I'm in full agreement with what Ellen just said about needing to be a little bit more particular about how we're descripting in lieu fee. And as such, it might be that header might not be appropriate. So I'm having a hard time kind of right setting Ellen's recommendation, which I agree with, and whether it's then appropriately housed within this section is one comment. And then citing scorecards, I believe those are more accurately described as pollinator scorecards. And then I can also send some more particular language on the work that Maine Audubon's doing on vegetation management guidance. That's a little bit broader than pollinators, but is appropriately placed in this section.
Okay. Okay, that would be great. All right. Jeremy, go ahead.
Can we circle back to the in lieu fee? I wasn't really sure, and maybe Ellen, if you wouldn't mind just repeating what you said. I didn't really follow what you were asking for, and I may have a reaction to it or not at all. So I just want to be sure what you were suggesting is something I understood, because I missed it. Sorry.
Yeah, no worries. I just, at the end of last meeting, when we were talking about in lieu of fee, I believe Nancy, although maybe I'm misremembering this, but I believe it was Nancy who suggested that we include language that said, because right now we just say, but the nascency of the effort did not provide particular guidance to the stakeholder group at this time. But having some language in there that, although that's true, like this may be a concept that we want to continue to explore as more information becomes available or something like that.
Yes, and the note that I made from the last meeting was that your discussion was, in terms of this policy tool in general and why it didn't become an actual recommendation in the recommendations section, was that collectively you thought that the tool required further analysis. That was sort of my cryptic note about it.
So can I just react to that briefly? So I'm certainly happy to take a look at whatever language Nancy or anybody else is going to look at. I just would what you just said there, Jody, I think is probably what I, maybe others said at the last meeting, which is I just don't want to use New York as the basis for some policy when New York hasn't really done a whole lot yet. So if we're going to basically say something relatively light and fluffy that as more information or experience becomes realized, this may be something we want to consider down the road. Okay, I think conceptually, but if we're starting to lean in and say we should do this a year or two from now, that's very, very different.
Thank you. Ethan, do you feel like you have enough to work with in terms of this paragraph?
I think so. We're talking about probably adding a clause there that notes that this concept is worth continuing to monitor for future consideration or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Okay.
I didn't see the order of George and Nick. Did both of you? Okay, then George and Nick.
Yeah, I actually think the language is really balanced, and legislators always know they can go back to a concept. It's included in a document, and I just I don't want to get into pointing them in a certain direction of like, hey, in 2 years, when things have changed, and when this is all died down, this is what a couple of policy advocates really think you should be looking at. I think that rises to the level of policy advocacy that is best left to the individual organizations. And in this particular document, we have very, very fair treatment of this particular issue. And I think that I really like balanced language in government documents, not because we have to be balanced about everything and deal in false equivalencies, but I feel very strongly that respect the prerogatives of people who are going to deal with this question at some point again in the future. And just, they're smart. They know it's there. We've got it there. And for now, it's not enough. It's the implications of this program are beyond it. And, I think anything beyond that starts to get into individual organizational advocacy. And I think we've done a really good job of avoiding that to this point.
Thank you. Nick.
Thanks. Really just a comment. And I apologize in advance if it's not completely clear. On page 17, under Maine DEP land use regulation section, lines 16 through 21, citing that or mentioning that there was some development of some grazing best management practices developed here in Maine with a group of people and agencies this summer. I have a little bit of awareness of this, no involvement, and I know some of the people involved in the process, which I really respect, really sharp people, a lot of knowledge there. I'm not aware that any other state has grazing best management practices in the US for solar. There are certainly grazing best management practices by NRCS, by American Sheep Industry Association. There are whole volumes on what's called targeted grazing, which addresses this in part. But this development of best management practices for solar grazing in Maine, while not part of the task of this group, certainly it addresses in one way or another, one form or another, how it looks when the rubber hits the road. What happens when this group might be advocating that the legislature, for instance, look at adders or levers or whatever it may be for dual use or co-location. This other best management practices, while always a good idea to develop things like that, may create some barriers to some implementation of some of the programs or some of the vision of what farming under solar might look like. So while it's not part of this group, it is the work of this group, it is referenced, it is unique to my knowledge in the state of Maine that these BMPs have been developed. And I think it's just a working example of how we're having to move quick There's a lot of different processes and people, but sometimes there may develop unforeseen barriers to implementation out in the field. And I'm concerned around some of the BMPs. And I have a copy, and I look forward to sort of digging into them. I hope that out in the field that it's a working document of best management practices.
Mhm. Is there anything that you would like to see modified in this language to address this concern?
No, because it really wasn't part of the task of this group.
Yeah,
And I see and I'm aware that they needed to be developed. I'm just highlighting that elsewhere in the state, there are some unique things happening around farming and solar. And it's just identifying that.
Yeah, okay, got it. Thank you. Anything else in this section before we move to public comment? Okay, so I'm just going over to attendees to see if anyone would like to, Andy, did you have a comment? Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that it's just a little confusing. We're in section 8, correct? That dual use and co-location, or no, we're on public comment.
We're in section 7 still, if you
Okay,
want.
sorry. I think I got confused because Nick started talking about grazing. So I can just wait till public comment because then we're gonna take a break. So
Okay, perfect. So attendees, why am I not seeing the list of attendees? Okay, here we go. Anybody interested who's listening in on the line, like to make a comment for the group? And just a reminder that you also have the opportunity to submit public comments in writing through this week till the end of next week. And those comments would be sent to tom.gordon@maine.gov. All right, not seeing any hands raised. Then why don't we take a break and come back at 10:38, 10:45. Give you 7 minutes. That work? Okay, see you then. Hello. Let's see, how many are we? We're getting there. We're 8. Wait a minute or two more and then we'll get going again. Nancy, I mistakenly sent inquiry to the wrong Nancy this morning, along with Tom and Ethan and Selena. Do you have time right after this call to have a brief debriefing conversation or not? You're muted. You're muted, so I'm not hearing. Why don't you just
Sorry, I'm on mute. Sorry. I'm going to send you a little note about that. It's a tentative, maybe.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Sorry about that. But you're getting fainter on the microphone. Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Are you hearing me all right this morning? Okay. I don't know. Maybe I have too many papers on this desk. Yeah, let me know if it's an ongoing, if it continues to be an issue, George. So we did receive a public comment in writing that an individual asked that we could read instead. And so I'm doing that. Hello, on the topic of defining farmers, landowners, leased farmland, in an attempt to capture the nuance around who owns and controls land in Maine, I just want to point out that when we talk about farmers, we are almost always talking about men. I'm a 5th generation daughter in a family farm that was handed down from eldest son to eldest son and then sold into solar development. My female family members were not included in negotiating the sale and did not benefit financially from it. And they're the ones who are now dealing with the consequences of the land in their community being converted to solar. As aging farmers in Maine retire, or in the case of my family, when they die unexpectedly, and women continue to be left out of business decisions, I think support for farmland succession planning ought to be seriously considered in any discussion about preserving agricultural land that is rapidly being lost. This may not seem like a problem for this group, and this is a topic that no one wants to touch because it is personal and often painful, but this is an issue that we need to get out ahead of before large swaths of farmland, much of which is likely not in use, is sold off to developers rather than transitioning to the next generation of farmers. Thanks for all your work on this and for taking comments. I plan to send in more feedback on the report before next week, hoping that other people can learn from the problems my family is already facing about solar development encroaching on prime agricultural land. Best, Danielle. Okay. So let me just do a quick check to see if there's any other member of the public who would like to comment, and then we'll move on to section 8. Okay. So section 8 is the conclusion section. It includes the matrix that we've been talking about and runs through page 21. And so I just want to open up for comment. Go ahead, George.
Yeah, I just wanted to respond to that letter. You know, as a 2-time veteran of the conflict in Afghanistan, you know, women's issues are really, really serious to the success of any given society. And that most specifically can come through in terms of issues related to property. So although I think the author is correct that, the issue she brought up specifically in her family is not something we can deal with as a group. I think it is really important always to affirm that, the success of human society is dependent on really on equity and on good, strong outcomes, economically speaking, for women. And I just think that needs to be said. And I say that having seen a society and a country that absolutely tore itself to pieces. And I think part of the reason that happened was because of the absolutely horrific circumstances that the women of Afghanistan live in and find themselves in. And there's a very, very significant piece of why I serve publicly in a variety of different roles that has to do with my belief in the importance of improving our country and strengthening economic outcomes for everybody. So I'll just leave that for everyone.
Thank you. So I'm going to move us then to the conclusion section. It covers 3 pages. And is there anyone that would like to make comment on these 3 pages? Ellen?
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Jody, I just had a question.
Yep.
You're taking which sections right now? Sorry.
Section 8, which is pages 19, 20, and 21. It's the conclusions piece of section 8. Sorry. Yeah. It's the
No, that's great. Thank you.
Yep.
I have a comment on the purpose section under matrix of agricultural siting conclusions.
What
Sorry,
page?
considerations on page 19.
Yeah.
The first, I'm just wondering, because we do include language, before we include the bolded and italicized language, we do include language that any rubric for approaching siting considerations should be understood as general guidance only. The ultimate planning and design for specific projects and activities should be based on the site-specific evaluation of environmental, I would add, and agricultural conditions and economic goals of the landowner. So I'm not really sure why we have then the bolded and italicized language after that. And I think it's sort of then a little, I also find the language to be confusing as to what it's trying to say, given those the preceding sentences.
Okay. Others' reactions to that comment? Go ahead, Jeremy.
I'm probably at least partially, if not wholly, responsible for the request borderline hostage demand for the italicized and bolding. I just am very concerned that if we don't make it abundantly explicit that these are not supposed to be guidance or directives or anything to DEP, LUP, IF&W, or any community across the state, that's exactly how it's going to end up. These oftentimes do end up finding their way in there. And I believe for me, I have to have that in there. And if we can't find, if there's a way to tweak it, I'm certainly open to that. But if we don't have something really explicit like that, it's going to be really hard for me to want to put, our association's letter of support or acknowledgement that we support this work product if something very similar to that is not included.
Others' reactions to that? I just want to hear the rest of the group's take on that when they read it. Everybody else was fine with it, felt good about it. Eliza, are you wanting to talk or not? I'm trying to read body language here. That's why I always like cameras on.
I mean, I'll open my mouth without knowing what I'm going to say. I mean, I hear Jeremy's concerns. I also, but I feel strongly that this matrix is purely an informational piece, and one that, you know, I think thinking back to you know, what we heard from spacing on the gentleman from Monmouth's name, but that, you know, this is the kind of information perhaps that someone like him or others would be interested to know, that, or just to think about, to distinguish between prime soils and marginal farmland, just more to kind of like open folks mind up to the idea that within a singular farmland ownership, you know, not all areas are created equal. And man, if it's possible to put solar on marginal farmland, then man, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And maybe this a matrix like this would help encourage someone to do that. I also think that I heard in some of our opening remarks that maybe what we need instead of the matrix is really just some more affirmative language that that pursuing solar development on marginal farmland is I think something that we have wide agreement on, not to the exclusion of other farmland, but that marginal farmland or inactive farmland is perhaps preferable to other quality lands.
Others' reactions. Nick, go ahead, and then George.
So I think it's a pretty strong statement. It's a little bit surprising, but it's very helpful to understand from Jeremy why it's there. I think it could be tweaked. It could be wordsmithed a little bit and still, I think, be included because the way I actually read the chart is that it's not saying things are preferred, but it is making recommendations. And it is recommending, if the ultimate audience is the Maine State Legislature, it is recommending that decisions looking at the matrix encourage and incentivize and et cetera, et cetera. You know, you could tweak the language in the bold italicized statement to utilize some of the language in the matrix. I think, frankly, I would go as far as to say part of our task, in fact, was to make some recommendations that could be used to inform regulatory agencies. So to go as far to say none of this should be included, I think is actually contrary to some of the work we've been doing for the last few months. Perhaps you could tweak the language again to say that it wasn't used to establish policy, but it was used, it is offered as recommendations to inform policy based on this stakeholders group and group's work and all of those we have heard from in this stakeholder process. So I'm trying to find a way that we can honor it and keep it there, but also honor and look at the work we've accomplished here.
Thank you. George and then Ellen.
I think I'm really in agreement with Nick. This is the matrix is a really important tool. Okay, but and I think that we are doing our job to the legislature to provide them with this matrix and to say this is sort of where we think where we think things fall. The matrix is probably the single strongest point of the entire document. It's a very bold, clear thing. Okay, and when you get into writing government documents, and I realize that this is not, we're not writing a law, we're writing a policy recommendation. when you get into those areas, I think it's likewise very important to caveat what you're putting in front of the reader as saying, you know, this is not a final policy. This is not binding, you know, those kinds of things. And so I think by the same token, the bolded italicized language helps the reader understand that the table that's being put forth is not binding in any way or anything like that, because not all readers are equally informed when they're looking through. So I think it's actually helpful signposting to the reader, and in particular that, you know, that this is sort of, you know, this is policy thought that that then requires implementation at a later stage of whatever kind. So I actually think it would be a travesty to an extent to lose the matrix, but I appreciate Eliza's thoughts on trying to work around that. But I likewise feel that, you know, I think Jeremy's input on this has been very important to help us get to consensus. And so if this is what it takes in order to get consensus, that we have a sentence that's, you know, really, really strongly worded, and then we have a very clear table of ideas, you know, that's great, because that means we've achieved consensus.
Thank you, George. Ellen, and then Patrick.
I'm wondering if the language could be revised, because if I'm understanding the concern correctly, the concern is really that the matrix will be used as sort of a mandate, right? That you cannot build in these certain areas. Whereas, you know, I think what we've been able to reach consensus on is that this can be sort of a guidance material so that we're asking the right questions, right? So, you know, if we're talking about putting a solar array on prime soils, can we ask the question, is there a way to do a dual use project? Is there a way to sort of figure out how to incorporate some farming activities around the solar array so that we continue to have some agricultural production using those best ag? It sort of leads to sort of a series of questions, but there's, I mean, none of the tools that we're talking about are prohibitions. I mean, ultimately it is left to the solar developer and the landowner about what happens, but it's just reminding people that there might be other options that you can consider. And so I'm wondering if that last language, I mean, we do say, you know, prior to the bolded language that this is general guidance only, but maybe if we change that language to just say this does not, you know, prohibit other, you know, this is not sort of a mandate as to what kinds of development can occur on particular types of land or something along those lines, because it might be helpful guidance within those regulatory processes. But again, it's not, there are no prohibitions that we're advancing as part of this report.
Let me take Patrick and then see where we're at, try to summarize some options here.
Yeah, so I guess I kind of wanted to direct this question towards Jeremy so I can better understand his thought process here. So if my interpretation of your concern is right, you're worried that this matrix could become an albatross, I guess, thrown around a project in the regulatory process. But if this matrix were used instead as a tailwind to help some projects get developed without hindering others, then that would be okay. For instance, if this matrix could kick a dual use project into permit by rule category, then this matrix would be okay.
Yeah, Patrick, I think that's probably right. I mean, to me, I just look at these things from the vantage point of when you see the words encourage and incentivize, everybody says, well, we're just encouraging and incentivizing. And the way I look at it is the reverse, which is, what are you not saying? Which is, you're saying, well, we're effectively saying these are the areas, these are the things we want to do. So the reverse of that is, well, then there's things we don't want to do there. So are we effectively discouraging, disincentivizing? And that's my concern. And so we just see all the time these conversations that take place in stakeholder groups that produce a document that suddenly it becomes a guidance document that some permitting agency uses, and then it effectively has the force of law, whether it goes to rulemaking or there's statutory change or not. And that's what I'm looking to avoid. If the outcome here was just that we were able to advance well-cited dual-use projects and we get more of those, I am fully on board, and I think that is a terrific outcome. But I am fearful of what we're not thinking of and not anticipating, and maybe some of what is left unsaid within the matrix itself.
So I think it could be helpful, recognizing the industry that you represent, Jeremy. I think it would be helpful to hear from other representatives, other industry representatives on the group. Fortunat, I'm wondering if you have an opinion on this. Caitlin, who else am I missing? Matt, we don't have right now, but I think it could be helpful to hear your perspective on this. Either one of you, however you.
Yeah, I think I agree mostly with what I'm hearing from Jeremy. I think he is representing a concern that exists across the industry. Again, not with the words on the page, because I do think we've done a good job of writing even the matrix as sort of in affirmative language as opposed to restrictive language. But Jeremy has, and lots of people in the industry have the battle scars of lots of previous similar experiences, and so I think we would be wise to understand that we need to. I mean, the more we can do to sort of make sure that these that this report is used in the way that we intend it to be used, the better, because once it's published, it's out of our hands. So all we can do is sort of affect the words on the page.
Got it. Okay, thank you. Caitlin, do you have anything to offer?
Yeah, I'll just agree. I think Jeremy's concerns are very well put. But I also think as we develop the rest of the report and make more specific recommendations towards the end, I think this matrix becomes less of a focus and more of a tool if we are clear about what the actual recommendations of the report are and the next steps that we would like to see taken that probably don't include the matrix as part of that. But specifically, I think including the bolded and italicized sentence is important if we're going to include the matrix in the report.
Thank you. Okay, so one question would be, I'm seeing a few options here. One is that we make no changes to this at all, and you all decide to advance it as it is. Sorry, Emily, you go ahead, and then I'll try to summarize, please.
Sorry, my video is being wonky. But what I wanted to say is that there's so much nuance in this that I think it is difficult for us to simply have one paragraph and then present it, and that it probably warrants further detail to really explain that the encourage, incentivize, what it is that we're really trying, what message we're trying to put forward with that here, and that maybe that would also increase the comfort and consensus with keeping it in.
So you're suggesting additional language to sort of make the expand the purpose statement with more description.
Yeah, less around the purpose, but it's difficult, I think, to fully interpret this without more information. So someone coming in that hasn't been a part of our discussions, I think could not, or could potentially misinterpret some of this. And so if we had a little more description language, not necessarily purpose, but like actually describing some of the situations in here, that might be helpful.
What is the group's reaction to that? I'm sensitive to the timeline that you're under and that you have one more meeting as well as the public comment period. So if you liked language that was developed to flesh that out further, great. You'd have one more meeting to confirm that. If you didn't, I'm a little concerned about kind of derailing a body of work that you've spent a fair amount of time on. What's your general reaction to the approach that Emily's proposing? 2 thumbs up. Yep, I see you, George and Caitlin. Okay, and I'm seeing a lot of thumbs up. Selena, go ahead.
I think it just matters what the additional language is covering and speaking to. So I think a small group to kind of look at that would be helpful and before the next meeting. And if it's not already in there, I think a message around the viability of dual use too is important. In the recommendations, we talk about how we need a pilot program before we have steps to fully implement or incentivize dual use. I think similarly in the matrix, there should be some reference to the viability, both in terms of economics, but also from a agricultural standpoint too, when fully encouraging. So just one comment.
If you all are Patrick, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. So I guess the original concern that I heard from Ellen sounded like the concern was that sentence was more or less redundant. So if that was the concern, then I think it's okay as it stands, and accepting one sentence of redundancy is better than adding an entire paragraph or two, especially where I'm advocating for a little more brevity in the report. So that's why I put my thumbs down.
Yeah, George.
Just wanted to say, there were a couple really good words that were brought up that if I'm not mistaken, are not used in the current memo. And one was informational, and the other one was not pursuing prohibitions. And I think that's why I support the idea of adding additional language here. And the reason I do that is because I think if we're going to have some extra mileage on this report, this is where we want to do it. I think this is the place where it really counts. We could cut away at a lot of the other stuff, like the out-of-state policies and things like that. This is the area where we're talking about policy in Maine. And if we have to add there, that's a good place to be adding meat onto the bone to sort of help flesh that out a little bit better. Because this is really the guts of what we're delivering to the legislature. So I think nuance and adding more nuance here is very, very helpful.
Thank you. Was I seeing Eliza, you're wanting? No. Okay. So I think, go ahead, Fortunate.
Well, I was just going to ask, do we think, we're trying to be pretty clear about what we don't think this matrix should be used for. Do we think that we would benefit from, fleshing out sort of a little bit more explicitly what we do think it would be used for? That might, make some of us who are concerned about it more comfortable when you say sort of explicit, this matrix is for this. That reinforces it's not for that. It's a little funny for us to present this matrix and say, here are things you should not use it for. And that's kind of it.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you for dialing us back there. I think I'm hearing more of you wanting to add than to leave as is or subtract. Is there a small group that would like to volunteer to draft some targeted additions here? I was a little concerned, Emily, with the direction that you were going, where I was thinking I was hearing you coming up, the idea of coming up with a number of examples of how this could be applied. I think what I'm hearing more is along the lines of Fortunat's recommendation. Let's be clear about how we were envisioning this would be used. And perhaps leave it at that. If you all want more, that's fine too. I just want to make sure I'm reading the room correctly. I think
that was my intention, Jody, not to give specific examples, but to really just sort of elucidate the meaning behind the situational differences here.
Okay. Nick?
Yeah, and I agree with that. Just to be clear on where I'm coming in, I'm not advocating removing this because I think Jeremy brings up some very good points. But while we're sitting here talking, I'm looking back at LD 820, the language of LD 820. I mean, that's part of our task. So if there's going to be considerations for how this can remain and be respectful and recognize some of what Fortunate and Jeremy are bringing up, then I think it's also helpful to look back at LD 820 in that process. There's some language right there is my point.
Yeah, got it. So before I take you, Fortunate, let me just be clear on who was offering to help draft. I saw Emily and Ellen and George and Nick. Okay. And Jeremy. Great. Let's do that. I think that's important. Fortunate, go right ahead.
Since I didn't volunteer to participate, I was just going to throw in that, you know, one way I think to do that fairly concisely is something I think I heard Selena say, which is essentially to explain how this matrix to some degree informs the context for the recommendations that follow, right? Things like the dual use pilot and the sort of considerations are sort of driven by the you know, the considerations that are in the matrix. And so then that helps to say, you know, we built this matrix and we've already sort of used it to inform this set of recommendations.
Awesome. Yeah, that's great. Okay, I think we have a plan. I just didn't get two names down. I'm sorry. Emily, Jeremy, Caitlin, Ellen was there, and there was George. And that was it. Okay. May I leave it to one of you?
Jeremy had also volunteered.
Sorry?
Jeremy had also volunteered. And,
yeah, I got him.
Okay.
I got him. Can one of you offer to sort of herd the cats to get this? And Emily, thank you. Okay, perfect. Then I think we can move on. Do you have another comment, Fortunate, or is your hand up from something earlier? Okay, great. You did not volunteer. Sorry, Caitlin. Great. So we've got 4 people. It's Emily, Jeremy, Ellen, and George. Do I have that right? Okay. Oh, and that's who it was, Nick. Thank you. Sorry about that. Yeah. All right. Then why don't we move on? Are there any other comments on any other parts of this conclusions section? So pages 19, 20, and 21. I guess we're just the definitions of dual use and co-location are the only other pieces of it. Let's take advantage then of our remaining time for the recommendations section. Andy, you go ahead.
I just wanted to point out that it's a little confusing, the definition between dual use and co-location. It talks about grazing of livestock in both. And I think what is trying to be said is co-location would be strictly grazing of sheep in just a standard ground mount array. But it just might be helpful to just, you know, throw the word sheep in there or something, because otherwise it just seems like there's overlap there.
And so that would be line 17. Is that what I'm hearing? Sort of instead of, for example, co-location can include grazing of sheep instead of grazing of animals. Is that your suggestion?
Yeah, just some sort of clarification as to why, you know, why grazing of animals falls under both categories. It's confusing because it's there, but there's no explanation of why grazing of animals counts as dual use in one situation, but not dual use in all situations, or, you know, so.
Yeah, so I want to throw this back then to the individuals who were drafting this. I'm not sure that one wording change that I suggested does your point justice, Andy. And that was Emily and who else? Emily, Caitlin, Ellen, and Nick. And do you mind having an offline conversation about that? Okay. Okay, then let's move on then to the recommendations section, and I'll just start taking comments on any of them. Go ahead, Nick, and then Caitlin, if I got that order right.
Sure. I just wanted to point out that the National Center for Appropriate Technology, NCAT, and I'll put it in there, through a pretty generous grant from the Department of Energy, has developed an agri-solar clearinghouse. I'm not sure it's completely online yet. I was looking again for it last night, but there will be, if one of the recommendations is the creation of a centralized clearinghouse of information for the state of Maine and all constituents. I just think that the NCAT clearinghouse could be used to inform that. And I just wanted to identify that.
Great. Okay, thank you. Caitlin and then Ellen, if I have the order right.
Thanks. Quickly on recommendation 2, I do agree with, I think Ellen said it right off the top, that all the recommendations should kind of stand alone. I think that makes them stronger. And if we're looking to expand upon them, just makes the most sense. But specifically under recommendation 2, I would advocate for on line 14, taking out the reference to New Jersey's dual use program as a model, just because it is not completely defined yet. And I don't feel comfortable making a recommendation based on something that's kind of amorphous and undefined. Yeah.
Got it. Okay. That makes sense. My apologies. I have not been tracking well the order in which these hands have been raised, but I'm going to say Nick and then Ellen and then Nancy and then Patrick and then Emily. You're fine, Nick? Okay, Ellen?
Yeah, I just wanted to echo Caitlin's point that I think when we were talking about the different policy tools, I don't think we sort of were discussing them as the sort of removing the withdrawal penalty for current use taxation for sites on current dual use projects on current use taxation enrolled land, or trying to come up with standards for co-location or dual use and permit by rule is sort of only connected to the dual use pilot program or only coming after the implementation of the dual use pilot program. And so I think those should be sort of standalone recommendations.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, I think we're hearing that from multiple parties. That sounds good. Nancy, Patrick, and Emily, and then Selena.
Thanks. I would think with, I agree with standalone 2A, 2B becoming 3 and 4. And I think when we talk about dual use pilot, I think that we just might want to be a little bit more descriptive about size, scope, and effort, because the term pilot can sometimes infer something small and not particularly aggressive or audacious. And my personal takeaway was a pilot specific to dual use needs to be robust enough to prove itself and to be successful. And so the size and scale that we're contemplating needs to be referenced here to some degree. Clearly don't need to design it here, don't need to get into a ton of detail, but are we comfortable in being a bit more descriptive in what our expectation would be in terms of how large we would want policymakers to think big when designing and supporting financially a pilot program. So just throwing that out there.
Do you have a perspective on scale at this point of any kind?
Well, I think the reference to New Jersey was just the fact that I think it's 200 megawatts, if I'm remembering correctly, and had some build outs to it that sounded quite robust. So that I completely understand Caitlin's point that New Jersey in and of itself is not fully designed, and therefore we should avoid hitching our wagon to something that isn't fully fleshed out. But I think that the other pilots that we've seen and forgive me if I've misinterpreted, are, you know, at cooperative extension locations in Massachusetts or something like that. So my overall point is, let people understand that when we talk about a pilot program, it needs to be robust enough and well-designed in order to really make it accomplish something that we want to lead to transformational change down the road.
Got it. Thank you.
And then my other point was recommendation 1, that DACF be the one to house the clearinghouse of information. I'm not going to object to that. There are so many moving pieces relative to data in the state of Maine that I think it's hard to tell as of right now how that will all come together and who should be ultimately responsible for that. If the group would prefer it to be the department at this point in time, that's fine. But the department ultimately right now does not have much solar capacity at all. And so perhaps a recommendation somewhere in here needs to be building out the department's capacity for more solar specificity and technical assistance. Thanks.
Got it. Okay. All right. So I'm going to take Patrick, Emily, Selena, and Nick in that order, but I would love also if others of you, including those 4 that I just mentioned, have any reaction to Nancy's point, that you weave that in as well in your comments. Go ahead, Patrick. I'm sorry. Go ahead and yeah, Patrick. Sorry.
Okay, so in 2A, which I understand might become recommendation 3, but in 2A on page 22, line 23, where it says the stakeholder group recommends further consideration of treatment of land and road, etc. I feel like that language is a little bit confusing, and so if that could just be clearer that we're recommending this land remains in the farm use exemption or is able to roll into another one without tax penalties. And then further in the paragraph, let's see, lines 26 through 30, if it could be more explicit about how the solar panels are considered for tax purposes. So if we want to explicitly say that we recommend solar equipment be regarded as agricultural equipment, and that the state should reimburse the municipalities to the fullest extent under the law, I think that would be useful from a municipal standpoint.
Got it. Okay. Any concerns about that? I'm just, if you want to just like raise your hand if you have concerns about that, so I know to flag that. Okay. Then Emily, then Selena and Nick.
First, in response to Nancy, I think that additional language would be helpful, and it may just be that we need language along the lines of a robust and projects that allows for diversity of projects to inform best practices. I don't think we need to put any necessarily numbers because that's not our charge right here, but I agree. Filling out that language to make sure that pilot program is something that can sufficiently inform.
Mm-hmm.
Moving on to recommendation 2B, I would suggest that the title change to standards for dual use and co-location in the permit by rule review, because it discusses both below. And same recommendation as Ellen and others, that those should be standalone. And so I want to make it clear that even if a dual use pilot program doesn't go forward, that there should be standards developed for both of those.
Got it. Okay, clear. Nick, Selena, and then Nick, and then Ellen.
So first on the Nancy's comments, I think on the data, I just suggest DACF and other agencies as appropriate, so that solar companies don't have to report to multiple agencies on their data. So that's one comment. And then on the 2A and 2B, I'm struggling with the purpose of the pilot program versus making fundamental changes to state policy around taxation in particular, and maybe permit by rule, but I feel less strongly about that. My understanding of the pilot program is to understand the viability of dual use and have more experience with it on the ground. And so I guess I'm concerned with this group without that experience moving forward with making changes to tax policy without further conversation with communities and understanding the implications of that. I want to make sure that we're including things that are encouraging it. So maybe the permit by rule could be its own to allow for these projects to be more quickly implemented. But I do have concerns with the moving to A as its own recommendation.
Let's definitely circle back to that in a moment. Let me make sure I get Nick and Ellen's other points, and then and if you have comments about that in particular, please weave that in, but we'll circle back to that. Go ahead, Nick.
I may, while taking notes, just missed some of Nancy's comments, and I tried to catch some of Emily's. I think it's been said, because Caitlin hit it in the comments, that more than one pilot, that if we're really looking at dual use, that we have to look at a number of different examples of what might present viability, what might work, and there are some that are recently opened and are available to look at in the state. So I guess that's all I wanted to say, and I believe it's been said. So
okay, perfect. Ellen, and then George.
Yeah, my other comment was really with recommendation 5. I feel like it would be stronger if we sort of listed specific follow-up steps for kind of exploring for how, you know, an adder, for instance, for dual use might be part of that larger conversation, and if there could be coordination between the DG stakeholder group and maybe this group when it came to that piece, or maybe the department, or just, you know, some other group that is focused on the agricultural piece. I think having a recommendation specific to that coordination would be helpful. And then in terms of the scoring criteria, it just sort of lists it, but without any kind of what could be follow-up steps for thinking that through. And I don't know if the intention is just that, you know, we'll have that discussion in the legislature as different, you know, procurement bills come up, or whether we sort of see that there is a way to sort of flesh that concept out more. And if I could just, I don't know, do you want me to respond to Selena's point right now?
Yeah.
So I think actually, since we are sort of talking about dual use in other contexts, right? For instance, the adder group, right? We said that sort of the, you know, DG stakeholder group would consider the dual use adder in the context of other adders, and that work will be happening next year. And so to me, it feels like there can be other sort of broader ways of supporting the establishment of more of these projects, because I think that is a helpful way of seeing how they can play out, and also for figuring out the economics of them. And I think with current use taxation, we specifically put in the provision that the project, in order to avoid the withdrawal penalty, the project would still have to meet the requirements of the farmland current use taxation program. And so in my mind, if a farm is, if there's still agricultural production happening such that that farm still qualifies for farmland current use taxation program, then just because there's, you know, now a dual use project on that farm doesn't negate that, such that I don't think a farm should have to pay the withdrawal penalty, or the developer should have to pay the withdrawal penalty in that context.
Okay. Thank you for that. Let's go to George and Eliza.
So to speak directly to Selena's point, I think this is a very healthy proposal to on the treatment of on the classification for panels that are primarily serving the farm's electrical load. I think that's a really, really positive thing, and it could actually end up being one of the most positive things that comes out of this group, at least initially. So I'm very comfortable supporting that as a standalone recommendation. on its own. And I think that, sort of speaking relatively broadly, I think that on the municipal side, I think a lot of municipalities can appreciate and value how, this particular classification treatment is going to continue to encourage and support agricultural development and agriculture in general, and family agriculture especially, statewide. So from a policy side and from a tax side, I think we're on really, really solid ground having this as a standalone recommendation. And I think it's actually highly beneficial in many ways. So I don't see this turning into a situation where the municipalities are going to be concerned about lost revenues. I'm sure there's a possibility that an analysis of this could, claim that there's going to be lost or missing revenues or whatever. But I think that in the overall context of attempting to preserve agriculture, there's a very, very strong argument to be made that this is important as a standalone recommendation.
Thank you. Eliza.
Thanks. I wanted to build on what I heard from Ellen about recommendation 5, and I'd like to see a stronger nexus between the recommendations from this group and the work that's being done by the DG stakeholder group. And I think, my initial thoughts on that would be, calling for an opportunity for this group to present our report to the distributed generation stakeholder group. And then perhaps also when that group begins to specifically address the land use and siting components of their work, to make sure that that this group is consulted or their expertise is called upon when that happens. I think that this current language is suggestive of that, but I would encourage us to have really more specific language about what that looks like for us to be in conversation. I think that is a potential to have a lot of value add for the DG stakeholder group, so that they're not needing to revisit conversations that we've had in depth.
Got it. Okay.
I've got some stuff on a couple other ones as well. I want to echo what I heard from others again about having not a 2A and a 2B. And I would push back a little bit more what I've heard on what is right now recommendation 2B. I heard in our conversations about a PBR process as not necessarily our enthusiasm for PBR. It was not limited to the incorporation of dual use and co-location into a PBR permitting review, but for it more generally and specifically incorporating land use elements into the PBR. And that gets me to where I'm seeing kind of something that's quite absent from this report, or the recommendations are what I felt were fairly robust agreement and discussion about policy recommendations that are specific to land use as opposed to type of development. I feel like there's wide consensus from this group on want to support policy recommendations that that encourage development on already developed lands, on otherwise impacted lands already. And I want to make sure that that is made clear within these recommendations. And then one last thing on recommendation, the dual use pilot program, getting way back to Nancy's comment at the beginning of this conversation about action items. I want to make sure that, we say in here that a pilot program would be developed by DACF and the Governor's Energy Office. I think that that's absolutely right. But I want to make sure that those agencies have the resources that they need to do that. So does that mean that we need to suggest that there be a budgetary item to support that work? Like, what is needed? And I encourage us to go through all of the recommendations with this in mind, but what is needed to actually implement this? Do we want to, and I'm wondering if that could be some work that happens between now and the next meeting, is that a group gets together, and I would really love to have, you know, Nancy and Selena and be part of that conversation of, you know, what are the needs to actually get at the recommendations? What is a realistic timeline? Things like that. So again, getting back to, you know, a comment that I made previously, that we need in order to kind of move these things forward.
So did everyone understand Eliza's second to last recommendation? I want to make sure, because this is sort of a new thing that's not in here in any form. And does that need to be repeated in some way, summarized? Because I need to see what you all think of that. Okay, could you do that again, Eliza? Explain what you're recommending be added in.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure if it would go in the recommendations or otherwise, but what I heard as being a broad consensus of a want to encourage development on already impacted or developed lands.
I have heard that as well, and I'm not convinced that is a recommendation. It belongs in the same way in the recommendation section, but it's your call as a group. So we'll figure that out.
I think, I mean, oh, sorry.
Please go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I think there was support for that, for what Eliza is saying. I think, though, there's been questions about whether this is the right group to be tackling that. But I agree, if there's a way to figure out, because I do think that is a strong recommendation that's held by many members of the group. And so figuring out what the right coordination mechanism is, or you know, way of sort of advancing that discussion, I think is important.
Okay. Well, so I'm hearing, as going all the way back to many of your initial reactions to the report, this idea of the recommendation, each recommendation would benefit from kind of an action, a section that gets at action item. What's the next step? I think that's certainly something that could be added into each of these. I'm wondering about, Selena and Nancy, your reactions to Eliza's recommendation around, you know, having some offline conversation about the needs of various departments to help to actualize these recommendations.
Yeah, I think that if we're going to make them more specific recommendations, then making sure that they're appropriately supported and the agencies is good. So happy to be part of that.
Great.
Okay, anyone else in addition to Eliza working with Selena and Nancy on that? Somebody else that wants to be part of that conversation? Caitlin? Okay, that would be great. And may I leave it, Eliza, in your court to coordinate? Okay. All right. We are at 1:15. I want to make sure that there isn't any other major comment on a recommendation that we haven't covered yet. And if not, then we might just spend the remaining minutes making sure that we're kind of on the same page on what needs to happen next, and then sign off. Any last things before we move to that? Okay. So I think all of you took good notes in terms of what you offered to volunteer on, but there are about 3 or 4 different subgroups, if you will, working on revising some language. I can send out a quick email to all of those of you who are implicated, just in very brief form, what my understanding is of what these subgroups are doing. Yeah, I will do that. Let's see. And I think in terms of the redrafting process, at least what I've done when I've been the primary drafter, and I'm sure that Ethan will be doing this as well. He'll be listening to this tape again and trying to capture everything in the redraft. You will have just one more opportunity to weigh in on this. And so what you're going to get for the next meeting will be a redrafted document that incorporates as much as possible what happened as part of today's discussion. You'll also have a separate document that is a summary of public comments. You'll want to read that really carefully and decide what of that were sort of aha moments for you that you think actually should be referenced in the final document. Because once that meeting is over, I'm sort of imagining that you'll give this planning team, Ethan, Tom, Selena, and Nancy, and myself, kind of the final directive of those final changes that you want to make. They'll be made, and then it's done, and you'll see it when it's done. So we want to make sure that we get a clear read from you at the next meeting as to what your reaction is, both to the redraft and to the public comments. Tom, if you're still on the line, have we received public comments yet?
No, I have not seen any emailed comments yet.
Okay. What am I forgetting? I do see a gentleman asking if public comments were taken from the audience. They were, but you're welcome to if you're still on the line. Chris, welcome to jump in right now if you'd like. I think we might, it's Chris Byers, Ethan, if he needs to somehow be brought over as a panelist in order to speak.
He's on his way.
Okay.
Okay, I think I did it. Am I here?
You're here. How are you?
Good. Nice to see all of you. I had to jump off for a bit, but I was listening for the first half of it. I guess, one of the, my name is Chris Byers. I work for as a consultant in Maine, and I have permitted probably 100 projects in the state, and so have a pretty deep bench understanding of what towns need, what landowners are talking about, and what regulators are doing here. We get asked a lot about dual ag, oftentimes just more out of curiosity. One of the concerns I have, to just kind of cut to the chase with this this report, is that I'm concerned about unintended consequences that come from this. We certainly do not want to be in a position where we have an incentivized program to push people to do dual ag when it may cause projects to become dual ag when they shouldn't be. So I'm concerned about putting a cost adder out there, because solar developers are notorious for just trying to squeeze every bit of profit out of the project that they can. And I do get concerned that if we have a financial incentive that pushes this, that we're going to be trying to fix a problem that really isn't there. I like the idea of providing a pathway where there being standards and having some successful projects that get kicked off. I know Blue Wave's doing a Rockport project, and there's a lot of data that's going to come out of that. But I just wanted to ask this group, I guess, so my closing comment here is, how is this group going to address the concern about unintended consequences? Massachusetts has tons of negative things that have come out of their dual ag program that have made it difficult to see why it happened in the first place. So just trying to see how this group can address the concern about unintended consequences.
Great, thank you, Chris. Nick, go ahead.
I think that's a fantastic question from Chris, and I'm glad that he gave us his comments. There's one thing that jumped out that I think sort of aligns with this somewhat on page 19, right underneath the purpose of the matrix. There was some language that said site planning for agricultural activities and solar development must reflect the unique circumstances of each location in terms of soils, topography, microclimate, and the goals of the landowner. That's perhaps not a full or big enough bucket to catch all of Chris's concerns, but there's a number of places where there is I think a pretty good, maybe not exhaustive, nod to site-specific considerations. In some cases, soil-specific considerations. If this were a full panel of farmers, maybe that would go even deeper. Could it go deeper? Yeah, but there are some areas where there is a nod given to that.
Great. Okay, I think we're at an end point. Is there anything that Selena, Nancy, you feel like we have forgotten, haven't covered, that we need to before we sign off? Okay, then I'll get an email out to folks within the next day or so with a whole bunch of sort of to-dos. This timeline, as you know, is tight. And so I would encourage all of these subgroup happenings to basically happen next week and resolve changed language by the end of the week. I realize it is a short week. If it needs to go into the beginning of the following one, so be it. But by that point, we will have closed the public comment period. So it would be great to have, additional language wrapped up by nearly the same time. Maybe we can have the following Monday a goal for wrapping up this subgroup work, and that would be November 29th. So just have that on your radar. And otherwise, I think we're good. Thank you so much for sticking with us. It was a very substantive meeting, and really I'm grateful for all of the detailed reading that all of you did. Chris's comments be included. Yep. So I've got, we were saving the chat and we've taken notes on everything. And it's in the video as well. All right. Thank you all. And yeah.
Thanks,
so
Jody.
Yep. Thank you. Take care. And Nancy.
Are we meeting on a different Zoom?
I think we
Or-
are.